So I'd like to introduce our guest today on Two Hard Questions, David Leyonhjelm, who's here to talk about libertarianism.
Libertarianism is a way of thinking. It's a philosophical attitude. Like communism is an attitude. It's a written philosophy, but communism is, or socialism is too, and so is anarchism. So libertarianism is a particular philosophy. How did I become a libertarian? And I have to say small L libertarian, because if any Americans are listening to this, they will immediately think of the Libertarian Party in America. There is no such party in Australia. My party is the Liberal Democrats, which the Americans immediately arc up over because they hate the word liberal and they hate the word Democrats. So it's a double barrel problem for them. So I've always been interested in politics right from my early days. My first venture into politics was Young Labor at the grand old age of about 19 or 20 or something like that. Too young to vote in those days. You had to be 21 in those days. And the reason was because I opposed conscription. The conscription was a factor in those days. I wasn't never opposed to military service or the army. I was opposed to the Vietnam War, Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, but I was never opposed to military per se. I was just opposed to compulsion. So I also was opposed to the government's attitude to recreational drugs, especially marijuana. In those days, abortion was illegal. This was Victoria. Doctors and women were being arrested. I couldn't see how that was good policy either. So there were some things that I was against. I thought the government was intruding into our lives unnecessarily. And I didn't realise that I was a libertarian at that point. I was just annoyed with the government. I, for a little while, joined the Labor Party and went through the phase of young people thinking that the answer to economic issues is socialism. And so the more I got to know that, the more I started to wonder whether that was right. And then I went overseas and saw some notionally socialist countries and realised it wasn't right at all. Came home, wasn't involved in politics for a while. Then I joined the Liberal Party, thinking that that would be a complete change. And it turned out that they were only slightly less socialist than the Labor Party anyway. So that didn't go very far. My sport is shooting, though, and I then became very conscious of the vilification of sporting shooters. Somebody would go and murder some people and the criminals who did it would get arrested, but the rest of us would also be punished, all of us who just were interested in shooting as a sport. That annoyed me intensely, but it was again part of a pattern of the government intruding into our lives and doing things which I didn't agree with. I joined the Shooters Party, as it was then called, in New South Wales, and I was actually its chairman for 5 years and ran election campaigns and things like that. But then I started to realise that most of the members of the Shooters Party, especially the hierarchy that I was dealing with, were very selective about their attitude to personal liberty, to being left alone. They would argue vociferously that the government should leave shooters alone because they're doing no harm. But then when I suggested, well, we shooters have something in common with people who do other things that the government doesn't like, but which do nobody else any harm, including smoking marijuana, for example, or even gays. Homosexuality was aspects of it were illegal in those days. I got howled down in the Shooters Party. They wouldn't have a bar of any of that sort of thing. So very selective attitudes to personal freedom. So I became somewhat disenchanted with them as well. And the Liberal Democratic Party had been established by half a dozen young, naive, but very committed libertarian-minded people. The party was in grave danger of dying because they were much better at starting things than finishing things. And so I joined the party and essentially saved it from withering away. Built it up. I ran it for about 8 years as the treasurer, as the party treasurer. I wasn't the president or anything like that. I just ran it as the treasurer, and I looked after its administration and its money and basically provided direction and got things done. And then in 2013, we were running in the federal election. I drew #1 spot on the ballot. I had a very good preference flow organised, but getting #1 on the spot with Liberal in our name, obviously, a lot of people thought they were voting for Tony Abbott's Liberal Party, and so I got a massive vote. And had it not been for the double dissolution in 2016, I would still actually be a senator, because you get a 6-year term, and those 6 years are up on the 30th of June. But as you will recall, there was a double dissolution in 2016, and so all seats were vacant, and I ran again. I got re-elected, but only for 3 years. By that stage, though, I was a bit over, particularly federal politics. It's not very much fun being unable to walk down the street without being stared at and spoken about and all that sort of thing. Anonymity is an underappreciated virtue. And so I didn't miss it much. I decided that state politics was probably more my cup of tea anyway. Federal politics is largely about economics. State politics is more about nanny state intrusion into your life and the things that really annoy me. So I decided to have a run at politics, and I very narrowly missed out on a seat in the New South Wales Legislative Council, the upper house, at the election last May. So I've been a businessman ever since then, or resumed my life as a businessman ever since then. And but I am still philosophically a libertarian. I'm still involved with the Liberal Democratic Party in New South Wales. And while I have the floor, Americans will probably understand when we talk about libertarianism in the Liberal Democratic Party, and in fact in Australia generally, I think Americans probably think of classical liberalism as the closest thing to what we're talking about. They hate liberals, of course, as they call them, because they think they're left-wingers. We don't think of them in those terms. But Americans, as soon as you say classical liberal, they go, "Oh yeah, I get it," and that's probably what we mean when we talk about libertarianism in Australia.
It's interesting that you mention that, because I spent 8 years in Colorado, and Colorado is probably the hub of libertarian culture in the United States. And if you think of people like, Ron and Rand Paul, in a sense, they reintroduced Americans to, true libertarianism. And I think, you running also, introduced Australians to libertarianism. Was there any mainstream libertarian culture in Australia in the past, or is it a blow-in from the United States?
Yes and no. Was there any libertarian culture in Australia? There was a bit. The Workers' Party, which became the Progress Party back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. John Singleton was a member. Ron Manners from Western Australia. A number of other people who they're now obviously somewhat elderly. They formed the party. They ran in at least one election, perhaps more. Did relatively well in percentage terms, but never picked up any seats, and that's fatal for a political party. If you don't win any seats within a certain period of time, you'll disappear. And it disappeared, and it's hard to keep a party together without any seats. So they're the only party, and even they were patchy on the libertarian side, there were some issues that they wouldn't touch, or they didn't want to go near because they couldn't agree on. In New Zealand, there is the ACT Party, which has had up to 5 members in the New Zealand Parliament. So, and they are pretty much libertarian, although they wax and wane a little bit, but they're pretty close to it. So, and have we imported it from the United States? In philosophical terms, no. The idea of being left alone by the government, that people are capable of making their own choices about their life and don't need the government to tell them how to live, that the government's only role really is to protect property and stop you from hurting other people, and, you know, pretty much stops there. That's not a new concept. We didn't need to import that from America. But it must also be said that quite a lot of ideas on how to put that philosophy into political terms have been helped along by what's occurred in America. Ron Paul inspired a lot of young people in America. When I was elected, a large proportion of my supporters were youngsters like Ron Paul's. I met Rand Paul when I went to America in 2017, I think it was, and he's libertarian, but he's much more pragmatic than his father. I would describe myself as somewhere between the two of them. And some of my inspiration has come from people like Milton Friedman, for example, who is really quite libertarian most of the time, and his free to choose, well, I think you'd call them podcasts these days, his talks and his videos on political issues of the time, and how the government really didn't help most things, they made them worse, were quite educative in my case, and quite a lot of other Australians I think too. So there's been cross-fertilisation between America and Australia, but the idea of being left alone by your government, that's always been here.
Gotcha. All right, well that's a great introduction, David. I'll hand over to Jackie for our first of 2 questions tonight. So Jackie, over to you.
Thanks, Gerard. Hi, David. Hope you're coping in the COVID lockdown at the moment.
Are you in Scotland?
No, I am Scottish, but
we'll add the subtitles later.
Hi. So my question, you mentioned a moment there ago about your time in the Senate, and I noticed towards the end of your term in the Senate that you had a heavy focus on what we would call men's rights. And I saw your recent article in the Financial Review as well, entitled "We Need to Find Out Why Men Are Not Okay." So my crunchy question is, do you think misogyny is a problem in Australian life? And does feminism conflict with libertarian values?
Okay, so do I think misogyny is a problem? Yes, but not to the degree that we sometimes hear about. I mean, I don't believe in male patriarchy and all that nonsense that goes with it. But there are undoubtedly some men who see women in traditional terms, and that means they don't welcome their involvement in certain occupations. They don't welcome them competing with them for jobs and that sort of stuff. There are some men with that attitude. So, you know, misogyny exists, and it will probably take a couple of generations before it's gone. Is it a big problem though? No, those sort of people are thoroughly outnumbered by people who, like me. I mean, to be frank, I have never thought of women as anything other than different biologically. They're not intellectually different. They're not different in the sense of being less equal, except that they're not physically as strong. And I do subscribe to the men are from Mars and women are from Venus philosophy to a degree. You know, trying to apply my logic to my wife is a exercise in futility, and I just
say the same.
Yeah, she thinks the same about me. So, you know, women and men are different, and I think, you know, I like that. I quite like the fact that they're different. But I've never thought, you know, that women are not entitled to the same educational opportunities, the same career possibilities, the same opportunities overall as men. Having said that, I have dubious thoughts about paid parental leave, for example. Having children is a choice, and you know, you should live with the consequences of your choices. I don't like taxpayers funding childcare. I acknowledge that it makes a big difference to a lot of women to get back into the workforce. And so I can see the logic for it, but I'm sure if somebody asked me, I could come up with a better way of doing it. Anyway, and I don't have any children, and every time I say something about why should people like me subsidise children, I get a huge amount of support. So, you know, there are a lot of people who share the same views, but by the same token, I don't think women should suffer permanent career damage because they have to look after children while they're small. So looking at it from that aspect, feminism, when in the early days, feminism was just a reaction to misogyny. It was a quest for equality. And I was extraordinarily sympathetic towards it. You know, we used to have unequal pay for equal work. Men and women would be working side by side in exactly the same job, doing the same work, and the woman would be paid less because for no reason other than that she was a woman. And I thought this was really unreasonable. And so I suppose at that point I said, okay, feminism's not that bad. I can't see anything wrong with that argument. These days, of course, feminism is despised by the most intelligent women that I know, the really smart ladies who I think are absolutely wonderful. They would never call themselves feminists in a million years, because the feminists these days blame men for everything. That they adjust the statistics to claim a gender pay gap. They blame men for practically everything that's wrong with the world. And so long as feminism is used as cover for that kind of stuff, then I think feminism is a very unhealthy and not at all practical approach. But it wasn't always that way.
And how do you see that fitting in with libertarian philosophies, though? Because I think all of us here would pretty much agree with the things that, you know, you've said, that we've all been there. But if as far as political things go, you know, the media would probably paint you as, you know, the biggest misogynist in Australian political sphere, and I would, you know, completely disagree with that, and I think the others here would as well. But how does it stand that someone as yourself, such as yourself, who is so sympathetic to you know, equality, ends up being painted so badly? I think that's a thing that we all struggle to get our heads around.
Oh, when you have a public fight with a Green, you know, you can be labelled any old thing, and Green supporters are not the brightest stars in the sky, and so they'll swallow any line that's trotted out, and they'll repeat it. It's a bit like, you know, the Chinese supporters of the Chinese who support the Chinese government. Whatever the Chinese government says, they'll trot it out over and over again. Green supporters are a bit like that. So, you know, if I get called a misogynist by Sarah Hanson-Young, and she said that because I called her a misandrist, that's sufficient for most of her supporters to repeat the label. And yeah, I mean, I don't stress too much over it. To be quite frank, it's, you know, the people who know me, the women in my life, they all laugh about it. You know, the question is, you know, is there any truth to it? Should I change anything that I've been doing? And none of them think there's any justification for that. It's just if you throw enough mud, some of it sticks. That's all.
So, but the media would paint libertarianism as a form of alt-right, and the alt-right would be considered to be, you know, anti-women and misogynistic. So it's not just, I think, a problem with personalities. It would also seem to be a slur on libertarianism as well.
Yeah, well, the media is not very sophisticated in political terms. I improved it somewhat when I got elected. Before I was elected to the Senate, I used to be told by the media, you're confused because you're left-wing on social issues and you're right-wing on economic issues. You support low taxes and less government spending, for example, which they view as a right-wing view, and you support same-sex marriage, legalisation of marijuana, that sort of stuff, which are left-wing issues in their mind. So they used to tell me, not ask me, tell me that I was confused. When I was elected, that gave me an opportunity to do a bit of re-education of them, and we actually had a little quiz on our website, and I introduced them to the four quadrants, you know, the left, right, on social issues, and left and right on, or whatever you want to do it, authoritarian and libertarian on social issues, and left and right on economic issues. And they got it through their heads, some of them at least, that politics wasn't a single axis spectrum, and that many of them actually did the test, did the little quiz on our website, and secretly confided to me, although they could never say it in public, that they were a little bit libertarian themselves. It was actually quite funny for a little while. So I don't have, I mean, I think they've made a lot of progress. And the Liberal Democrats now have a guy in the Western Australian Parliament and two in the Victorian Parliament. And they're out there pushing the libertarian drum as well. Of course, the New South Wales media have been exposed to me, and the Canberra media have been exposed to me. Most of them are still there. So they're reasonably up to speed on what libertarian means. And I quite often, when I do get labelled as far right or alt-right, although alt-right is used as an insult, it's used as another name for a Nazi. And the Nazis, of course, were left-wing, economically at least left-wing. So that usually is used by, the alt-right label is normally used by people who are very confused and don't know what they mean by it anyway. But I quite often find that the media who have had exposure to me or my colleagues don't pick up on this alt-right label because they know better. So I think we've made progress. The Libertarian Party in America has been going 50 years. There's a Libertarian caucus in Congress as well, comprised of senators and members who are libertarians. They call themselves the Freedom Caucus, I think, but they're based on libertarian principles. So there's a deeper, libertarianism in America has deeper roots than it does in Australia. But I can tell you, compared to 6 years ago when I was first elected, there are now at least roots for libertarianism in Australia, and there weren't any when I first got elected.
Gotcha. Jackie and Steve, do you have any follow-up questions for Jackie's question?
Well, I have one. Just a sec. Okay. Given that the government seeks the advice of experts in order to inform legislation and policy, and such experts invariably come from universities, what checks and balances exist to ensure that the political radicalization rife in universities does not unduly influence government policy?
That's a very good question. And the bottom line is there are not enough checks and balances. It depends a lot on the caliber of the advisors and to some extent the caliber of the ministers, because it's ministers who make government decisions ultimately. Their advisors can be extremely influential. Sometimes the advisors make the decision and the minister's too stupid to know what they're agreeing to, really. And sometimes it's senior public servants who are key to government policy. And but these experts, these academics, or virtually always public sector employed. So they might be universities, so they might be research institutes or somewhere like that. They're practically all public sector. They give advice. They position themselves as experts. And they give advice to the ministerial advisors, the department, or sometimes directly to the minister, although invariably a minister has an advisor with him or her. Now, when a decision is technical, complex, requires a high level of expertise, there's a tendency to defer to the experts. And we saw that with the response to the coronavirus inquiry. The medical experts were essentially running the show, and the politicians and the advisors, the ministers and the advisors, were deferring to them almost entirely. And of course, we see the chief medical officers in each state and their deputies up there pronouncing what you can and you can't do with no checks and balances whatsoever. And that's a very good example of how bad it can get, essentially, when you have unaccountable people calling the shots. Although, in fairness to them, they're giving advice to the government, and the department, the ministers and the ministers' advisors are either too stupid or more often too lazy, too scared to challenge them over it. That's a pity, because if they had done that, we may have had a less economically damaging response to the coronavirus. There are many other options that could have been followed, which would have not crippled the economy and thrown millions of people out of work. So that's a good example where checks and balances don't apply. In other situations, you do have people having a strong influence on policy, but then sometimes you have sometimes they get overruled, and sometimes politics intrudes. When a drug, but examples of where the so-called experts have absolute say is whether or not a drug is approved for treatment of coronavirus. That would be a classic example. A diagnostic test, the minister won't challenge the experts, the advisors and the department won't challenge the expert has the final say. But then when you get on water policy, you know, how much water should South Australia get from down the Murray or down the Darling River? The South Australians will trot out their experts to argue that there's no such thing as not enough water. But then and the New South Wales and Queensland and Victorian experts will say, yes, there is, but ultimately it'll become a matter of politics, and the ministers and their advisors, and there'll be arguments behind closed doors and all sorts of things, and then they worry about safe seats in South Australia and all that crap, so the experts get sidelined to some extent.
Gotcha. Jackie, do you have anything else?
I do. I'm just waiting for the dog to stop drinking his water, and he's giving me a dirty look here. But look, my follow-up question was really around, we saw in 2018-19 movements like Me Too, Believe Women really coming to the fore, and really from my own mind, the question I'm trying to grapple with is, do you believe these are a cause for good at all, these kind of movements?
Mostly not. The equality of opportunity, this is a perennial argument that we have with left wing. The left wing want equality of outcome. Those of us who are not left wing want equality of opportunity. So the whole feminism stuff that's been imported into left wing is all about equality of men and women and equality of outcomes. So if there's not enough women in boardrooms, if there's not enough women chief executives, if there's not enough women doing all the high-powered jobs, lawyers and all that sort of stuff, they hardly ever argue about equal numbers of women do the low-paid jobs, of course. It's always the high-paid jobs that they focus on. So that's the argument, that's the proposition that they're looking for, is equality of outcomes. So how do they go about achieving those? That is by various tearing men down in some respects. It's the same as you see with the socialists. How do you make life more equal? You don't raise people up from the bottom, you drag people down from the top. So, tax the rich, take money off the rich, that'll make the poor richer. It's wrong, it doesn't work as a matter of fact, but that's a very, very common proposition. So how do you make women equal to men in outcome terms? You drag men down. So the Me Too movement is part of that. So they go after high-profile men. In some cases, they are misogynists. I mean, Harvey Weinstein, for example, is a fairly unpleasant character, I suspect. But they generalise from a specific case to all men and try to make up rules. So you don't get the Iraqi immigrant who thinks women are embarrassing because they're not wearing chadors. He never gets criticised. It'll be some drunk, high-profile politician, CEO, bigwig, who pinches a reporter's backside, who is under assault. So it's a very selective process, and it's really not about equality of the sexes in terms of opportunity. It's equality of outcomes that they're after, and it's just a variant, as I said, on the argument that socialists have of tearing down the rich.
And David, how does that work in, I think we've all seen, the video where you grill the public servants about manipulation of data to do with things like domestic violence. Mm-hmm. How as a libertarian do you deal with really, manipulation of data to vilify men as a way of achieving some kind of equality?
Oh, dealing with that kind of stuff, you're a long way from implementing your libertarian policies, I can tell you. You know, all you can do is hold back the tide in some respects. So going after the health department, the women's agencies on domestic violence, was really an attempt to challenge them on this tearing men down thinking. So how do you tear men down? Well, you characterise them all as violent. No acknowledgement that it's only some men, it's only certain situations, it's even certain cultures. No acknowledgement that Indigenous men are overall much more inclined to be violent. It's all men are all potentially violent, and it's the same approach as we need more women on boards, we need more women lawyers, we need more women partners, all that sort of stuff. Same sort of thing. So, I was simply attempting to poke a hole in that whole charade. Same with the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, or whatever they call themselves. You may have seen me quizzing the bureaucrats on that too. They manipulate the data to make it seem like women are being done over on their pay. They're not being done over at all. It's a load of nonsense. They're manipulating statistics to argue that men are being paid more than women and that that's unjust. Now, the only way you could correct the injustice that they're pointing to is by positive discrimination for women, in particular for high-paid senior jobs. Now, that's part of their agenda, is positive discrimination. They don't want to get more women into drain digging and garbage collection and things like that. They want to get more women into the high-paid jobs. That's their objective. So again, when I was challenging the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, it was to point out that they were misusing statistics and being fraudulent in order to pursue their agenda of tearing men down. And you know, it's such a long way removed from libertarianism. Libertarianism is being left alone by the government. In my libertarian world, nobody would be counting this bullshit about male salaries and men and women's salaries the same or different. We wouldn't have any public servants employed to collect that sort of information, because it adds nothing to the economy.
And David, do you think that in a libertarian world, men and women can be equal without these things like affirmative action?
We have to define what you mean by equal. You mean equal? Equal opportunity? Equal opportunity?
Yes.
Yes, equal opportunity, absolutely. And we're pretty much there. We're pretty much there. You know, you look at the career opportunities available to women these days, and there's precious little of that's not available to them because they're women. You know, I struggle to think of anything. There are some career opportunities where they might struggle because of their physical size, their physical strength, but that's about it. But there are some occupations where men struggle to compete with women. You find very, very few men these days in childcare centres or even primary school teaching. There's not many men there. Now, is that a result of discrimination against men? Yeah, there is a bit of that, but it is also quite likely some, you know, natural aptitude. Some women are more likely to be better at those things than men are. They tell me that men make better architects than women too. And it is certainly true that there are a lot more male architects than female architects. Now, you know, if you just look at the straight numbers, you could say, oh, that must be discrimination. Somebody's not hiring women architects. But if you look at aptitude, it may not be anything to do with discrimination at all. I suspect that's the case. So anyway, if you are referring to equality of opportunity, then I'm all with you. If you're referring to equality of outcome, I'm sorry, no, the answer is no.
And within the membership of, you mentioned that, you know, you had a lot of young people who were interested in libertarianism. Were they equally men and women, or were they predominantly men?
Actually, that's a little embarrassing. There are a lot more males than females. There are women amongst them all, but yes, there is something about political activism when you're somewhere between 17 and 25 that attracts men more than women. I don't know what it is, or whether it's a chromosomal thing, whether it's because it's too much of a boys' club in political meetings. I don't think that's the case, but you never know. And certainly in the Liberal Democrats, we've agonised over that a bit. And when you do get, you know, 90% blokes in the room, they can be a bit of a boys' club, and that does put women off. But I think that's only a small part of the explanation. It's much more likely that that people of that age, men and women of that age, and men are just more likely to take an active interest in politics than women are. That goes for the Liberals and the Labor Party to a large extent too. The only party that has, I don't know exactly the numbers, but has that doesn't have that preponderance of males is the Greens, and even then, I'm not sure that it's not more men than women. It's just they end up with more women being pre-selected because they just want to demonstrate how nice they are.
Gotcha. All right, Steve, well, over to you for question number 2.
Okay. How has the COVID-19 pandemic changed Australian life, and how will it impact on personal liberty?
Yeah, I've actually been writing a few articles about this just recently, so it's very much a top of mind subject. There are 2 aspects to it that I should mention. One is we have had a massive authoritarian assault. We've got probably unconstitutional barriers to travel between the states. Section 92 and Section 117 supposedly prevent that sort of thing, and yet it's been done anyway. We've had laws restricting us to our houses, getting arrested and booked for going outside our houses for the wrong reasons. We've had our economy seriously damaged by government edict. It wasn't a typical, it's not a typical recession. In fact, it's about to become the worst recession we've had probably in over half a century. I think it's going to be very, very unpleasant, and it's all due to government action. It's not due to the natural economic cycle. And you know, we've had download the app and we'll let you go free sort of thing. Those kind of conditional, be a good boy, be a good girl, and you'll be allowed to be free sooner. We've had the app itself, which is basically a system for the government to follow you around and find out who you've been meeting. So, you know, there are some very, very worrying authoritarian aspects to the outbreak, which, if you look at Sweden, are unnecessary. And Sweden's got a higher death rate than Australia right now, but we are not anywhere near the end point of this epidemic. I'm a vet. I used to be a vet anyway, and I know about herd immunity. It's this, and that's got to be the end point when we've got herd immunity. Now, we can get there either by everybody getting vaccinated, or at least most people, or most people catching the disease and getting better. And a very small number will die. It's not actually a very fatal disease if you look at the serological studies, the antibody studies about how many people have caught it and shown no symptoms. The fatality rate's actually quite low. But anyway, the end point is not where we are now, and it's not the point where Sweden is at. The end point is when we reach herd immunity, when most of us are immune to the disease one way or the other. And so what's happened is that the government has suppressed it, not just flattened the curve, suppressed the whole disease to the point where we're not developing herd immunity. We're remaining immunologically naive to, as the immunologists would say, and we are as vulnerable to this virus now as we were 3 months ago when it first got going. Unless there's a vaccine comes along, quick, smart, that's a possibility, we are all going to have to catch the disease and get better in order to develop herd immunity. So I can't see that in the long run we are any better off than Sweden, which is basically letting it rip and taking social distancing measures just to avoid overwhelming their health system. Now, the other aspect about all this whole disease outbreak is the fact that Australians have barely raised a protest at all these restrictions. The Institute of Public Affairs started about 2 weeks ago, saying time to lift the lockdown. I've been saying it, but I'm just one bloke. The IPA's got more influence than an ex-senator. So, and they got howled down, and they kept at it, thankfully. They're a good group. But they got really ridiculed. We've now got more voices, and thankfully in America, they really arced up about the lockdowns and they protested. And in Michigan, of course, where open carry is permitted, they went on their demonstrations carrying their guns. And of course, everybody, including the police, which they're not, which wasn't the case here, the police were extremely well behaved too. It was a perfectly legal demonstration, and the police knew better than to act like a bunch of thugs, which you know, in the UK, and to a degree here too, they have been behaving like over this. And the disappointing thing that I was getting to is how little protest, excuse me, there has been to these authoritarian impositions. How little there has been in the way of resistance. People, Australians, have just said, well, you know, it's better that than dying, even though their chances of dying are about 1 in 500. They've sort of said, oh no, we've all got to do the right thing and stay safe. And the media has been flogging it every night, doing the right thing. That poor bastard who went for a run on Bondi Beach all by himself, couldn't have infected anybody, even if he was, you know, a blatant virus carrier, because he didn't come into contact. The only time he might have got into trouble was when the coppers tackled him, and he might have coughed on the copper in the process of being flattened on the ground with the copper.
This is the guy that ate the kebab, is it? Is that another guy?
Oh, that was the other one, yeah. Yeah, there's several of them. But one guy there, they jumped all over him, and up until that point, he hadn't been near anybody else. So if he'd been carrying the virus, the copper would have caught it, would have served him right, the clown. Anyway.
Interestingly, David, I should throw in, I have a quick anecdote along the same lines. My nearest neighbour here is about 1.5 kilometres away, so we don't really see many people. And I drove to Braidwood the other day, and I had a flat tyre, and I pulled over on the side of the road, and on this side of the road, probably 10 cars go down the road each day. But as luck would have it, as I was changing a tyre, an SUV from New South Wales Water came by, and 3 guys got out of the car to tell me off that I wasn't allowed to stop and change my tyre there. Those guys didn't have masks on, and I'm presuming they don't live in the same house. So for some unknown reason, 3 guys from New South Wales Water were driving around in a car in the middle of nowhere and decided that it was a good idea to stop and talk to me. They didn't offer to help me change the tyre and just drove away. It points like that when you realise what a joke the way the government are dealing with it is.
It's not only that, it's what's so disappointing is that the number of people who have signed up, they're saluting the flag, thinking that they're doing the right thing. Those people should have been ashamed of themselves. They should have helped you change your wheel and had more sense than to try to lecture you. A, they didn't have any authority to go lecturing you or do anything about it. And B, their attitude to the whole risk of infection was way out of proportion to the reality. And, it used to be that Australians would thumb their noses at authority. Or so I'm told. I'm not sure it was ever actually true. But that's the legend, that Australians did not accept authority well. Well, I've seen precious little evidence of that. Even in the UK, they had demonstrations against the lockdown. What did we get? So a bunch of dickhead anti-vaxxers in Melbourne who didn't even know what they were there for, I don't think. They certainly weren't primarily there protesting against the lockdown. We've had nothing else to speak of. Individual acts of, well, buggy, I can go to the beach if I like type stuff, but you really wouldn't call that, take that very seriously, especially not compared to what's happened in America. The reason they've now opened up all the states, relaxed the controls in all the states, is because of public backlash. That's not a factor here. And
you mentioned the anti-vaxxers. It seems to me that the only real resistance to all of this is the anti-vaxxers, and people like Pete from My Kitchen Rules are the people who seem to be getting the media coverage as people who are saying, well, look, if we get a vaccine to this, there's no way we'll be having it, and if you try to make it mandatory, you're going to have a fight on your hands.
Yeah. Yes. Well, so there's two aspects to that. One is the media is totally on board with the government's message. They're being completely obsequious. So it serves their purpose to ridicule anybody who isn't on board with the message. So you hear the commercial TV news in particular talk about doing the right thing, and then they quote police or public officials or somebody saying, you have to cooperate, you have to go along with it. We're all on the same side. We're all in this together. If I hear that we're all in this together one more time, I'll choke some bastard. Just me
an unprecedented times.
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, unprecedented. Yeah, that's right. So now I can't recall where I was going with this. Just remind me of your point.
Anti-vaxxers.
Yes.
No, well, you were really talking about the lack of opposition and how compliant Australians have been.
Yes, and how the anti-vaxxers are getting all the attention. That was your point. Yes. So
one of the things. Sorry.
It serves a certain purpose to ridicule people who are disagreeing with the government's approach, and if you can make them look ridiculous, then that suits a certain way of dealing with opposition. So the anti-vaxxers, I mean, they've always been around. They're the ones who go crook, that I don't want my kids vaccinated, but I still want subsidised childcare, and then scream their heads off when that doesn't happen. There is no compulsory vaccination. It's not compulsory unless you want somebody else's money. So there's no chance that a coronavirus vaccine will be compulsory. No government will ever do that. Not in Australia anyway. They might in China. But
one of the things I noticed. So one of the things I noticed a lot, particularly on social media, is a lot of people saying, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I mean, I myself am not an anti-vaxxer. I absolutely accept the efficacy of vaccines. But what they have said is they are opposed to mandatory vaccination. There does seem to be a very real fear that it's going to be made mandatory. I mean, whether that's a conspiracy theory thing, or whether it's people citing the Nuremberg Code and saying you can't force people to undergo a medical procedure. But they have said, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm in favour of vaccines, but I'm opposed to mandatory vaccination. It should be a matter of personal choice.
Yeah, so that whole thing is being conflated together in a whole bunch of conspiracy theories. So Bill Gates is supposedly, manoeuvring and manipulating the whole thing. Big Pharma gets a mention. It just goes on and on. And then, of course, the compulsion, the prospect of compulsion in relation to vaccination gets included in that. And those people who believe that sort of stuff are the same people who believe in UFO landings and Bigfoot and, all of that kind of stuff.
What? They're not real?
That's
Loch Ness Monster?
the only one that,
just like you've told me Santa Claus doesn't exist.
the only ones I believe in are drop bears. Anyway, so the reality is, of course, that the vaccines will not be made compulsory. That won't be necessary. There will be enough people like me who'll say, right, as soon as it's proven effective and it doesn't make me sick, I'm there. I had my flu vaccination last week, and I couldn't wait to have it because I know how valuable vaccination is. As I said, I'm a veterinarian. Without vaccines, we would not have pork and chicken and beef and lamb and so forth. They're vital to our lifestyle. I'm a huge believer in vaccination. So it won't matter. The anti-vaxxers, there's not that many of them. It won't matter if they don't have a vaccination, and if they catch coronavirus, the chances statistically are that they won't get sick. They won't even know they've got it. If they do get sick, they'll recover. There's a very, very small chance that they might die from it. And if they do, I just hope they don't leave some kids behind who haven't got anyone to look after them. That's about the only thing I worry about. Now, but the conspiracy theories are Bill Gates, which I find extraordinary. Bill Gates is the richest man in the world, I believe. He's certainly he's got more money than anybody could ever possibly spend. Why on earth he would want to make a heap of more money out of vaccination justifies logic, unless he's figured out a way to take it with him when he dies. What the hell is he going to do with it?
One of the accusations I've seen levelled at Bill Gates is that he has some kind of a messianic complex, that he thinks his wealth entitles him to dictate health policy or to save the world in some way or something like that. Now, I mean, whether or not that's true, I don't know. I would imagine that having that kind of wealth, that kind of power, it certainly would be very tempting to assume a messianic role. But of course, that's entirely the individual as well.
Yes, it is. And there's also, that's a well-known characteristic in Australians. It's called being up yourself.
Yeah.
And I think there's a very good chance Bill Gates is thoroughly up himself. That does not mean all the conspiracy theories about him and vaccination have any legitimacy at all. I think they're complete nonsense. Complete and utter nonsense. But they're getting a bit of a run at the moment. and the media likes, as I said, to demonise people who aren't on the team. So we're hearing a bit more about them than we otherwise would.
And David, speaking of the media, because the new media is social media, where do you see, you know, the big tech companies like, you know, Microsoft and Google fitting into the whole personal liberties thing in the future? That a lot of these conspiracy theories are propagated on their platforms. So, you know, and some of the conspiracy theories are about them themselves. Yeah. So, you know, do you think that, what was that, sorry?
With some grounds. I mean, I think it's Facebook is censoring anti-vaxxer posts. I think Twitter is into that as well. I mean, the minute they do that sort of stuff, all they do is feed the conspiracy theories. Mm-hmm. The reality is that they just think they know better than everybody else. They're big commercial companies. It's not the first time that a big commercial company has thought that it was cleverer than the average bear. That's you know, that happens. And I suppose for the rest of us, we can either ditch them, which to a large extent I've done with Facebook. I don't muck around with them much at all. I put stuff up there and then don't go back and look at it for a week. Or we encourage competitors, and there are competitors to well, not so much to Google, although Microsoft has Bing on search, and we're using Zoom, and Microsoft and Google has Google Meeting, so there are, you know, so there are alternatives to the big companies. It's hard to get away from Microsoft unless you go to Apple, and it's arguably no better. So, but ultimately my comfort comes from the fact that they operate in a competitive market and that there are competitors out there. It's just that at the moment they're too small to be major threats to these guys. But that won't last. It's a fast moving industry, the high tech business, and you know, you look back 20 years and these guys didn't exist, or they were a lot different or a lot smaller. And I think 20 years time, that things will have changed pretty radically as well. I mean, if you don't like Facebook, for example, you can go to Gab, or Twitter. You can go to Gab, and they don't censor at all. In fact, that's their proposition. There are other similar sorts of chatting type places you can muck around on and talk about anything you like, and mostly they won't censor you. And Gab makes, as I said, Gab makes a big deal out of the fact that it doesn't censor anybody. You can get up there with all kinds of outrageous crap, and people do, and they leave it there. Some of it I'd rather not see, quite frankly, but that's the way it is.
So it sounds to me, David, that really the biggest threat that we have as far as personal liberties in the future is really a lack of competition in the political sphere, not so much a lack of competition in technology and social media, although technology and social media may be driving that lack of competition.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, you can argue that there's a lack of competition in the IT area, and the reason there is a lack of competition is because governments have allowed, you know, what do they call them, oligopolies to develop. And so with a different regulatory environment, then the outcome might have been different. And if they change the regulatory environment, then the commercial environment would change. But if I can come back to your original proposition about what the biggest threat to our liberties is, it's not those companies. Ultimately, we all have the option of living without them. We don't have to go on social media at all if we don't want to. The biggest threat to our liberties is government. It's hard to live without dealing with the government. If you don't pay your taxes, they'll come after you. You disregard their laws in so many ways, they'll come after you. Right now, invite too many people around to your house, they'll come. Go to a pub with too many of your friends, they'll come after you. They're the threat to your liberty, not Google, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter. I don't like them that much. I don't like what they do, but in comparison to governments, they are not the big deal. They're not a big deal.
Okay. All right, terrific. Well, on that note, and my dog's just walked into the room, so on that note, we'll wrap things up. So I'd really like to thank you, David, and Jackie and Steve for joining in, and I hope that the people who watch this get a lot out of it if they do hang around to the end.
You're welcome.
Okay.
All right, terrific. Well, thanks for your time, everybody.
Yep. Thank you.
Good night.
All right.
All right.
All right, awesome.